Welcome to this History, Culture, and Diversity series presentation for Holocaust Remembrance. We're also live on Finger Lakes TV, Spectrum Channel 1304, and online at fingerlakes.org, tv.org, and Facebook. And we'll also be recording today's presentation for the benefit of those who can't join us today. I'm Dr. Robert Brown, Professor of History and organizer of this series at the college. And before we begin, I want to tender thanks to everyone who made today's event possible, including the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, the Social Science Office, the folks at Community Affairs and Instructional Technology, and the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester's Center for Holocaust Awareness and Information. Holocaust Remembrance recalls one of the 20th century's greatest human calamities, the organized, systematic, state-orchestrated campaign of persecution, harassment, violence, and murder perpetrated against Europe's Jews between 1933 and 1945. Ultimately, in the worst genocide on record, 6 million Jews and a comparable number of Slavs, Poles, prisoners of war, gypsies, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the disabled were murdered by Nazi Germany and its allies. It remains immensely concerning that public surveys continue to reflect a shocking lack of basic knowledge about the nature, extent, and impact of the Holocaust. A recent poll revealed that almost half of Americans could not identify a single Nazi concentration camp, sub-camp, extermination center, or ghetto out of the 40,000 that were operated by the Nazis during World War II. Almost 60% surveyed claimed never to have heard of Auschwitz, the largest Nazi camp of World War II, where over 1 million perished between 1942 and 1945. Holocaust distortion and denial is on the rise and continues to invade the public space and corrupt the discourse on this topic, especially on various social media platforms. Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Gilad Erdan, laments, quote, "We live in an era in which fiction is now becoming fact, and the Holocaust is becoming a distant memory. Holocaust denial is spread like a cancer, and it is spread on our watch." According to the United Nations official website, in a one-month period in 2021, over 4,000 Holocaust dismissing posts were removed from TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres observed, quote, "This is an urgent wake-up call that must jolt us into action to pursue truth, remembrance, and education, and together to build a world of peace, dignity, and justice for all." Mr. Guterres' warning is particularly pressing given the current resurgence of anti-Semitic activity worldwide. The Anti-Defamation League reported a 36% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. in 2022, the highest level since 1979. The League has also observed a 41% increase in reported anti-Semitic activity on U.S. college campuses last year. In the vital effort to heighten awareness of the Holocaust and combat religious, racial, and ethnic hatred in this country, we are immensely fortunate to have access to the personal testimony of those who witnessed firsthand the persecution, harassment, disenfranchisement, dislocation, violence, and murder of the Nazis, by the Nazis, its supporters, collaborators, and sympathizers. But their numbers are dwindling rapidly, so we must listen to their voices, introspect, heed their warnings, and apply the lessons they impart. Ladies and gentlemen, I am humbled and honored to introduce to you one such eyewitness and survivor, Mr. Warren Heilbronner. Mr. Heilbronner was born in Stuttgart, Germany in 1932, the very year that the Nazi Party became the largest political party in the Reichstag, and Hitler was poised to become the nation's chancellor and leader. In the next 6 years, Mr. Heilbronner's family witnessed the implementation of the infamous Nuremberg laws, which barred Jews from marrying non-Jews and deprived them of citizenship and the vote, and subsequent measures passed in Germany that banned Jews from attending state schools or entering any of the professional occupations. On November 9th, 1938, Mr. Heilbronner's family experienced Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, a nationally orchestrated program of vandalism and violence against Germany's Jewish population. Within less than 24 hours, 267 synagogues were destroyed, 94 Jews were murdered, and 30,000 were arrested and deported to concentration camps like Dachau near Munich. The latter included Mr. Heilbronner's father and grandfather. I will allow Mr. Heilbronner to relate more of this story. Fortunately, he survived Kristallnacht and the Nazi genocide and emigrated to the United States in 1939. Once here, he received an undergraduate degree from Cornell and a law degree from Columbia University. He became a very successful attorney at law for the Rochester-based Boylan Code LLP. Mr. Heilbronner has been extremely active with charitable and religious organizations since he came to the U.S., serving as past president of the Ark of Monroe County. He is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Union of Reformed Judaism and is a member of the Board of Governors of the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester. In the latter capacity, Mr. Heilbronner has worked tirelessly with its Center for Holocaust Awareness and Information to raise awareness of this enormous tragedy. It is in fulfillment of this mission that brings him here today. So please join me in welcoming our venerable guest, Mr. Warren Heilbronner.
Oh, well, thank you for that introduction. It boggles my mind. I'm honored to be here to speak to you about both our families, what we witnessed, my family, and coming to this country. And people ask me, well, why do you continue to speak? And my answer is very simple. I'm speaking for the 6 million who can no longer speak. As was said, I was born in November of 1932, the second child of my parents, Helmut Heilbronner, Dora Heilbronner, one older brother, Ludwig, and I was born Werner. When we came to this country, my father changed the first names of each of these men because he wanted no part of what is Germany. And so in America, my father became Harry, my brother became Leslie, and I became Warren. And so this is the background of our family. As was indicated, Hitler, the Nazi Party, was the leading party in the 1932 elections, and in January of 1933, the Nazi Party, which only, by the way, it's called they called themselves the National Socialist Party. They had a 33% of the population vote. All, 1/3, but they were the largest party, so they were asked to form a government. Hitler became the chancellor, and the power that he wanted to exude started. And although my parents wanted additional children, they felt once the Nazis were in power that it would not be a good idea to bring another Jewish child into the world, and so it is just my brother and I. Now, in my speech today, I'm going to go through the steps that it took for us to come from Stuttgart, Germany, to United States. We were the lucky ones. We were able to come to this country directly from Germany. Many of the survivors who did come to the United States eventually had to go through other countries, such as, I'll mention them later, before they could come. In my speech today, I'm also going to indicate the importance of the Holocaust in relation to what is happening today, especially, unfortunately, and I'm sorry if this hits some of you politically, the politics of 4 years ago. It was John Locke, Edwin Burke, who wrote, "The only thing needed for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing, just to stand by and do nothing." And this is a wake-up call for students. I'm too old to affect much what's happening in the country. It's you who are able to do it. Don't sit by idly and let somebody else take over for you. And an anonymous quote, which sadly reminds us, especially what is happening in this country today. When leading public figures dehumanize others, the descent from hateful speech to violent acts is often swift and severe. And I'll probably refer to it a number of times. I refer you to January 6th of last year. Now, I'll start with our family. What you see on the screen there is a cover of a family tree. Stammbaum is the German word for family tree. And you will also see the letter 1658. That is how far back my father's mother was able to create a family tree. Now that's, over 450 years ago? So how many of you can trace your family back that far? My brother and I were the 11th generation on that family tree. And I'm often asked, well, why, when Hitler immediately came to power, didn't your parents just pick up and leave? Well, this was our homeland. 11 generations had gone, and there had been anti-Semitic incidents in Germany for a long time, which I'll refer to in a few minutes. But this was it. We were a comfortable family. Stuttgart, Germany was not the hotbed of Nazism. That was in Berlin and Hamburg and in Munich. And so my father was not anxious to leave. Besides, he had a job and with his father-in-law. And so we didn't. But that was the beginning. Just a couple of things that I like to show. Oops, this isn't, or no, this is the one, I'm sorry. This is my grandmother. This was taken when she was 17. I like to show this picture because she was the one who made the family tree, because at age 17, and she was quite an accomplished pianist. Her mother sent her from Stuttgart to Vienna, Austria, which was the hub of the world in music. That's where Beethoven, Mozart, and the others were. She was enrolled in an academy there. At the end of that 1 year that she was there to take lessons, like students in Rochester and around go to Eastman for a year of training. This picture was taken. It was taken in Vienna. My father dated it a long time ago. There were two of them. This was one, and the other, unfortunately, was someplace where when the Nazis came to pack us up to come to this country, they must have taken it. I would give anything to have that picture because it was signed by the director of that academy. You may have heard of him, Johannes Brahms. This was our family. My father was the gentleman all the way on your right. His father was seated. His mother was sitting next to him. And the other two were his younger brother and his older brother. And you can see this was taken about 1919. They were well dressed, a very good family. My father had come from fighting in World War I. He, of course, fought on the German side, but being Jewish, no Jew could become an officer in the German army. My father's battalion commander, and some of you who may have studied history, was Colonel Erich von Rommel, who in World War II became Field Marshal Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, probably the best German general in their army. He was not a Nazi. In fact, he was ordered to commit suicide when the assassination of Hitler in 1944 failed. But that was our family. My mother's father owned this factory with 4 brothers, but by the time that came around, he was the only person running a factory. It was called Gebrüder, which in German is brothers. Loeb, that was the last name, and that was my mother's maiden name. And it manufactured union suits. What men who work outside that you see on our power lines and otherwise in cold weather, this is what they wear under their clothes to keep them warm. And my grandfather used to come to the United States every year from 1900 to 1914 to sell because they were a large factory. In fact, in 1912, he was in Southampton looking to come to the United States on a new ship, and passage was all sold, so he came to the United States on the USS Grant, expecting to see that new ship docked next to it because it was much faster. Instead, he saw the headlines, the Titanic had sunk. Thank God he did not get passage on the Titanic that day. This was our house that you see in the front. Just for my brother, my mother, and my father. We lived in that house. And with a live-in maid. We had a live-in maid who actually raised my brother and I. My mother belonged to a social club. She played tennis. She was a very good tennis player. And, of course, it was a Jewish club. And my father, who was a graduate of a textile engineer. When he married my mother, he found a job with her father's factory and became its superintendent. What's happening? Or am I doing the... Stop working. I hope it can... Maybe... see if you can... Yes. Okay. What?
You'll probably just try clicking that button down there.
Oh.
This one's not working.
Okay. Thank you. What you see there is probably the most important document that I have. Everything what you see, we have documents in our original documents. That's all. That's the size of it, 3 by 5, and just crinkly paper. Why is that important? Well, in 1936, up to 1936, once Hitler came into power, first of all, what he did was he kicked out all the professors in universities because the only thing that they wanted to talk about in the universities was about Nazism and the master race. That was their cry, the master race. We will be in power for 1,000 years. So they were kicked out. Doctors who were Jewish could no longer perform in non-Jewish hospitals and eventually could only perform on Jewish patients. There was massive book burning in which books that were written either by Jews or which were written about Jews and did not spout out the philosophy of the master race were burned in book burnings in city and town squares, and there are many pictures showing that. We don't have that in this country. All we have in this country, unfortunately, more and more, as you read in the paper, books being banned from school libraries. And it's very sad when a book like The Diary of Anne Frank, which really conveys the suffering that people went through, when books like that are being banned in our public schools. But that's what's happening, and it's very sad. So, Joseph Goebbels used to go on the radio every single day bashing the Jews. Whenever anything went wrong, the Jews were at fault. And there was a newspaper called The Stürmer, which did the same thing. It almost seemed like I was listening to Rush Limbaugh, the way he was attacking the people he didn't like every single day, and Michael Savage every single day. That's what he was doing. And then came the Nuremberg laws, which were mentioned. First of all, we lost our citizenship. When you lose your citizenship, you lose your right to vote, you lose your right to the courts. They can arrest you at any time, and you have absolutely no recourse. They also provided that Jews could not marry non-Jews. They also said that no non-Jewish domestic under the age of 45 could work for a Jewish family. Thank goodness our domestic armari was over 45, and therefore she could continue to live with us until we left. But this continued, but then came 1936, the summer of 1936, and all of a sudden, all of that stopped. There were no anti-Semitic posters. There were no anti-Semitic radio broadcasts. There was no anti-Semitism in the newspaper. Does anybody here know why? What? Correct. It was the time of the Olympics. And Hitler decreed that while the foreign press and the foreign dignitaries were in Germany, there was not to be any anti-Semitic actions. However, the minute they left, bingo, it started again. But during that time, my father was on a streetcar going to a cemetery with a friend. A friend said, "You better go to the U.S. consulate and sign up." My father said, "Why? There's nothing going on right now." "Don't worry, it will. Go down and sign up." So in the summer of 1936, my father signed up to come to this country. And he waited, and he waited. Finally, in July of 1938, you cannot see the date, it's all the way next to that number, he received this notice from the American consulate. Some of you may be able to read that. It's pretty, the German is pretty much like English on some of that. It was issued to my father with a number. Now, the United States had said that they would take 20,000 German Jews each year. Mind you, only 20,000 Jewish each year. And each year that was in progress, they would start with number 1. As you will see on that piece of paper, the number 5442 in July of 1938. Now, if you multiply that by 2, you come to a little bit under 11,000, the number 11,000. Although the quota was 20,000, the State Department, which was filled with anti-Semites, never, ever issued 20,000 visas in any one year. If they issued 12,000 in 1938 when German Jews were desperate to leave, they did not issue. And the United States did not take one refugee. You had to always go through this official form. 2 years after application, they finally listened to you. Isn't that what we see in the southern border? People who want to come into this country, they have to wait 2 years before they can go before a judge and indicate why they need to get out of the country that they're in. History repeating itself. Just like Santayana said at the beginning of the last century, paraphrasing, "He who forgets history is doomed to live it again," which I'm afraid we're doing now. But in any case, so finally this came. And so my father, but that was not the only thing you needed, because in 1929, of course, the whole world was plunged into a recession. And no country after 1929 really wanted to take any Jews. Where did the Jews who could not come to the United States go? Well, some went to Turkey, some went to South America, to Argentina, to Cuba. Some went to South Africa, there was a large German Jewish population that went to Shanghai, China. As I say, we were lucky. We were part of the 1938 quota. But because of the Depression, nobody wanted the Jews. France certainly didn't want them. France hated the Germans for what they did during World War I. The British didn't want them, although to the British credit, they would take 10,000 German Jewish children. But think of this. How would you feel being a parent, having two children, maybe the age of 7 and 9, and having to say to the children, we're going to send you to England now because we're fear for your safety here. We don't know where you're going to be in England, who's going to take care of you, and we don't know whether we will ever see you again, but we're sending you. How would you feel as a parent? But 10,000 children, parents sent 10,000 children to England under what's called the kinder or children's transport. On the other hand, our dear neighbors to the north, who we always consider very, very friendly, at that time had a foreign minister who wrote a book, a tract, in which he wrote, "One Jew is too many," and Canada never allowed one German Jewish to come to Canada. And it was only about 2 or 3 years ago, finally, when Prime Minister Trudeau issued an apology for what Canada had done to the Jews at that time. And what happened in the United States? Some of you may know the epic of the St. Louis. The St. Louis was a ship that was paid for by 978 Jewish refugees who sought to go to this country, actually to Cuba, because Cuba was taking at that time German refugees, and they all paid the Cuban government to go there. When they got to Havana, there was a change in government, and they wanted more money for them, and these people didn't have any more money, and eventually the ship was sent away. One person got off at that point because he had some money with him. The ship sailed up to Miami. The people on the ship could look out and see the lights of Miami. They asked to allow the Jews to embark into this country. They asked, the people in the United States begged Roosevelt to allow the ship to land and to unload. Roosevelt, who was now running for a third term, fearing that it would not look well to allow these people in, said no, and the ship returned back to Europe. Thank goodness the pilot of the ship, the captain of the ship, was sympathetic, and he let passengers off both in England and in Belgium, and the rest went back to Germany, and of those, about a third of them eventually found no way to get out and perished in the concentration camps. So here we were. So what the United States required was, let me see if I can get this now, an affidavit of support from somebody who would support our parents and us if he came to this country, because there was no social welfare, there was no Medicaid or Medicare or anything like that. So my father had an uncle who lived in Memphis, Tennessee, and he was our sponsor. This is the actual document. The seal is on it, and it was in duplicate or triplicate or whatever it is, in which he said that he was sponsoring my father, mother, and my brother and I, that he was making $250 a week, and that he was in real estate, and he had an estate of $20,000. Now, for people this day, $250 a week is poverty wages. Not in those days, because in 1938, when he gave us that affidavit, the minimum wage was 25 cents. 25 cents. So $250 was a lot of money in those days. That's when you could buy milk for 5 cents a bottle, and you had somebody delivering it to your door. So my father, armed with this affidavit and this little slip that you saw, went to the American consulate and said, here are the papers, please, can we have our visas to go out? Now, any of you who saw the Burns document recently, the three-part document of America and the Jews, at one point in, I think, the second segment, said that the American consulate in Germany was in Stuttgart, was one of the toughest ones in Germany. There was one in Stuttgart. And so when my father went there with papers, said, oh, yes, we see you have somebody who's sponsoring you, and we have your slip that says you can come in, but what we don't have is an affidavit from your uncle telling you, once you get there, how much he's going to support you with. He's just telling you what he's worth. We have to have an affidavit from him telling you what it's worth. So my father sent a telegram message back to the United States and said, please send me an affidavit with that information. And this was done in July of 1938. That affidavit didn't come. That affidavit didn't come. And that affidavit didn't come. Somehow there was a mixture or screw-up between the correspondence. And then came November of 1938. And just before that, the Nazis, you see, Hitler wasn't necessarily interested in killing the Jews at that time. He just wanted them out of Germany. He wanted them to make them Judenrein. You remember that after the First World War, Hitler was in the army, and so were many other Germans, and there was nothing for them. There was no Marshall Plan. There was nothing. They were just sent back to their communities. The economy was absolutely broke. The Versailles Treaty, backed by France, was terrible on the Germans. They couldn't have no army. They had to pay billions of dollars of reparations. Everything was pretty well taken away from them, causing a great inflation. In fact, in 1923, I have a piece of paper. It's not part of this. It's a banknote from a bank that was issued. Oh, yes, here it is. I'll just hold it up. It's just a little piece of paper, okay? What is it worth? It's a note from a bank in Frankfurt for 1 billion. It's 1,000 million mark, or 1 billion mark. It was worth nothing, absolute nothing. People were getting paid twice a day because what they were paid at noon would not buy as much as that when they were paid at 5 o'clock. That's how bad it was. Because, as you know, in economics, if I go to the store and give a grocer $1 to get a bottle of soda, that grocer knows he can take that $1 and go to his wholesaler and get that bottle replenished, because that $1 is backed by the government. These notes were backed by nothing, and so they were absolutely worthless. So most of the time, at that time, was barter. And at that time, there were a lot of people who were disillusioned, and they were plotting against the government. The government was a weak government. Do we see that in the Proud Boys? Do we see that in the Oath Keepers? They're plotting against the government. And their leader became Adolf Hitler. And they decided that the way to enforce that was to do a putsch, which is an uprising. And they were going to take over the Munich government. And they marched on the Munich police office. I guess it was something like those people marching on the Capitol on January 6, last year, to make sure that the United States government would not operate under the Constitution on which these people, the members of Congress, were sworn to uphold. They were going to make sure that that didn't happen. Well, Hitler was arrested, went to concentration camp, went to jail. While he was there, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, My Battle, in which he said, when I become chancellor, it wasn't when, if, it was when, I want all the Jews out of Germany. I want Germany, Juden Rhine. Didn't want to kill them, just wanted to leave them out. Well, by 1938, they weren't leaving fast enough. And Himmler and Goebbels had made out a list of what was going to happen to what they wanted to do to have it happen. Well, in October of 1938, Chamberlain came to Hitler because Hitler, at that point, had built up into the army, had taken over the Saar, which was a land between France and Germany. They had just marched into it. Earlier in 1938, they had marched into Austria and just took over Austria. And Hitler, so they met, and Chamberlain and Hitler said, look, I need some more living space. All I want is part of Czechoslovakia, the front part of Czechoslovakia. Once I have that, I've got enough living room. I don't want any more. Just give it to me. And Chamberlain said, okay, you can have it. No consultation with the Czech government. All of a sudden, the Czech people found out that they were being taken over by the Nazis. No country did anything at that point to stop the war machine that Hitler was building up. In fact, they were being supported by this country. We had people in this country who were very supportive of Hitler. Two of them that you may have heard of, Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh. And companies like IBM were supporting the Nazi movement. So Chamberlain comes back to England, gets off the plane, and said, Herr Hitler and I had a wonderful conversation, and Hitler had said that this is all he wanted, and I'm coming back to you to tell you that we will have peace in our time. A very famous quote by Chamberlain. That was in October 30, 1938. Hitler and the Nazis knew that at that point, nobody was going to stop whatever they wanted. And as they used to say about Hitler, heute Europa, morgen die Welt. Today, Europe, tomorrow, the world. At least now, when we have Russia invading Ukraine like the Germans invaded Poland, there is the United Nations, which is standing behind Ukraine to stop the Russians from what Putin said. All we want is a little bit more living space. And the Ukrainians really love the Russians, and so we want to help them out. Similarities? Yes, similarities. So what the Germans did was they sent out the Jews who came in from East Prussia after the First World War, sent them out back, and a family there contacted their son in Paris, telling him to do something because the Poles didn't want them, the Germans didn't want them, they were just sitting there. And he went to the German consulate to meet with the ambassador. Third in charge came out. Instead of begging him for his parents, he took out a gun and shot him. 3 days later, he died. Goebbels went on the air and said, see what these Jews are doing? They have no sense for anything decent. They're killing our government people. What are you going to do about it? What they did about it was Kristallnacht. They got their brown shirts. Hitler and the Nazis employed brown shirts who would go around the country roughing up opponents, anybody who was an opponent to the Nazi party, just like, unfortunately, we see with the brown shirts, with the Oath Keepers and the others, and the other anti-Semites that are in this country who have been attacking people in this country now. And to do the havoc. And what they did was, as was reported, almost every synagogue in Germany was burned down. Stores were looted. Glass all over the streets. And when the street lights shined upon them, it was like little crystals echoing, and that's where it got the name Kristallnacht, because of that. They went into houses and tore down pictures, smashed furniture. We were very fortunate because there was also a part of that decree that said, under no circumstances would any property owned by a non-Jew be attacked. If so, there would be severe penalties. We did not own that house that you saw. It was rented. It was rented from a non-Jewish landlord. So thank God they did not come into our house, destroy. But there were 25 to 30,000 men that were arrested. One of the first ones was my grandfather, because he was the owner of a large factory. When my father came home and was told that they'd been there, he decided he would go over and sleep at his grandfather's house, at my grandfather's house that night, because if the Nazis were there once, they weren't going to come the second. 5 o'clock the next morning, a loud knock on our door. My mother went downstairs. My brother and I scrambled out and looking down down the staircase, down to the door. My mother opens the door, and there were two Gestapo officers there to arrest my father. My mother said, he's not here. She said, they looked around. Of course, they didn't see him. And as they left, they said to my mother, he better show up, otherwise it's going to be hard on you, and left. My mother immediately dressed my brother and told him to go to Grandpa's house, which was about a block and a half away from our house, to warn my father that they had come to arrest him. Well, my father, as superintendent of the factory, with my grandfather gone, felt it was his duty to go to the factory. He walked in the door, and there were two other Gestapo officers who took him to the police station, from there to the concentration camp in Dachau. Now, at that time, the concentration camps were harassment camps. Hitler didn't want, as I said, Hitler didn't want to kill them. He just wanted them out. However, there were many, many people who could not stand the rigors. Barracks that housed maybe 12 or 15 men housed 80 men. The food was mostly soup with potato and very little else. And it was now November, December, and there were many who could not stand the rigors. Let me see what we have here. No, what did I do again? Help! What?
Can you take a look real quick?
Sure. Because I think it's more important that you see what's happening. Okay. That is the affidavit that my father needed. Because if, is it again up here?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. If you could prove that you were leaving, you could get out of camp. That affidavit was signed on November 8th. You may see the date. That was the day before my father was arrested. It came to the German post office about the 10th or 11th of November. My mother went to get it because she knew what it was in and that she could get my father out. She went to the post office and asked for it. They said, oh, my lady, I'm sorry, we can't give it to you. It's registered mail, and it's to your husband, and he's the only one who can pick it up. She said, but my husband is traveling. She didn't want to say he was arrested. He can't get it. Sorry, lady, you can't have it. For 3 days, my mother spent in that post office every day trying to get that paper. They wouldn't give it to her. In desperation, she sent a telegram to the United States. I hope we do better. Yeah. Oh, yes. I do want to show you this picture because this is the nameplate of my grandfather's factory. And what is pasted over it, you can see, is Jude, which is a German word for Jew. This was to tell the people of Germany not to patronize the factory because it's run by Jews. So this is how they were doing, and they're doing in stores as well. Come back to that later. I hate to make this like that. There it is. She sent a telegram to the United States saying that please send that affidavit to me because my husband is traveling. She didn't want to say he was arrested because she was afraid that if she did, that they would not send it. but they did send it because it is stamped that it was sent. You can see confirm at the bottom. 3 days later, when she didn't hear back, she sent another one, and this time she said, "He is in great danger. Send me the affidavit." Finally, about 3 to 4 weeks later, in the middle of December, that affidavit that you saw before came. My mother took it to the police station, and my father got out. Once he got out, we started to pack. And finally, in January of 1939, we went to the American consulate to get our visas. The gentleman who interviewed us said, "So where are you going?" Well, you had to say you had to go where your sponsor was, and our sponsor was Memphis, Tennessee. So we said, "Memphis, Tennessee." And he said, "Oh, Memphis, I come from Memphis, Tennessee. You'll love it. It's great. A lot of socials, and I'm sure you'll get a job." My father almost had a heart attack. Why? Because he had heard through the grapevine 2 weeks before we went to the German consulate, to the American consulate in Germany to get our papers, his uncle died. This was his obituary in the Memphis paper. Not a little one, a big one, because he was well known there. Thank God they did not have emails, faxes, or others in those days, because they didn't find out that he had died. Because if they had found out, we would have been on a train going east to the camps, rather than what finally happened, to be able to get on a train to go west into this country. So we got our visas. But then there was a second step. And that second step was to get the Germans to agree to let us go. So my father went to get those papers. Now, first of all, you have to recognize that in order to get out, first of all, they blocked all of our bank accounts. You couldn't get to a bank account. They required that you give up your set of silver. You had to pay a tax of 50% of everything that you owned. And another 25% of any inheritance, and another percentage on any papers or possessions that you were going to want to take out of this country. And so my father went to this gentleman to get our papers, and he said, "Okay, here they are. Give me 10,000 mark." He was blackmailing my father. My father said, how am I going to get 10,000 mark for you? They blocked my bank accounts. And the guy said, "That's your problem. You want these papers? Give me 10,000 mark. My father remembered he had some life insurance that had cash value. So he went to the insurance company and said, "I need to cash in my policies and get 10,000 mark to pay for my papers." And they said, "Oh, you're a Jew. We can't give you any money." So my father went back to the gentleman and said, "Look, I can get you your 10,000 mark, but the insurance company won't give it to me." So he picked up the telephone, called up the insurance company and said, "I'm sending this gentleman back, give him the 10,000 mark." He said to my father, "I'll give you 2 hours to get that money. If you don't come back in 2 hours, you can forget these papers." So my father went, got the money, paid the blackmailer, and got the papers. And on March 3, 1939, we were able to leave Germany. I'm going to show you a few. What time is it? I don't want to keep you too much longer. No. When my father arrived at Dachau, he sent a letter to my mother. A postcard, I'm sorry. That's the only thing you could see. Dachau was so large, it had its own post office. As you can see in the upper right-hand corner, the postcard has a Dachau stamp on it. That's where it was issued. It was issued to my mother. Do we have translation? I'm not sure. Yes, there was a translation at the bottom, which it said, I'm here and since Friday, and I'm all right. Don't worry about me. Give my regards to your parents, to Leslie and Warren, and to Max. That was the key to Max. Because my father was saying, contact Max and get the affidavit so we can get out. And he put it that way just as a note because no, I'm trying to get, the card. That stamp, you could only put it on in the upper right-hand corner. The rest of the stamp had to be loose, so you couldn't write anything on the back of the stamp, because the Germans were very careful that you couldn't send any messages out other than what you put on, which of course they read before they ever let the postcard go out. The rest of the stuff that is in German on the left is all of the orders of the camp. The bottom that's written is you can only write a letter if you got another letter, and it only could have 12 lines, it could only have one page, and a lot of other stuff that you could not have. They said you can send money because you could spend it there. If you put money in, if they put money in an envelope, the Nazis took it out before the prisoners ever got it. My father managed to survive Dachau. However, while he was there, he did sneak, because Dachau was in sections, and he did sneak into another section. If you were found in another section, you could be shot. But that's where his father-in-law was, to make sure that my grandfather was okay at that time. And he cites a fact of a gentleman who was sick, and another man, and he took them to the infirmary in Dachau. And as they walked in, left him there, and the orderly said, okay, he's here, let him drop out and go. And then my father turned, he looked in the back of that clinic, and he saw bodies, he said, stacked up like logs. People who just they could not survive. But eventually he got out. Now once after Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, every Jew, no matter how old they were, had to carry an ID card, Kenny card. You'll see that the Germans were very artistic. That's a great J they put on the front of it. On the inside, you can't see it because it's red. Underneath that top writing is a red J. That is my identity card, Heilbronner Werner, date of birth, and you'll see Israel. Every Jewish male was given the name of Israel as a middle name, no matter what it was. Every woman was given the middle name of Sarah, no matter what it was. Now, if this were my mother's or my father's ID card, there would be thumbprints on that and their picture. Because of my age and my brother's age, they did not require that. But that was the ID card that you had to carry around all the time, no matter where you went, although there were not many places you could go anymore. We couldn't go to schools, we couldn't go to parks, we couldn't go to movies. We had to stick around almost where we lived, and that was it. But if they stopped you and you didn't have it, they could arrest you on the spot. And again, as I said before, we have it here. That's what it looks like. Oops. That's what it looked like. In reality. And you had a list, everything that you wanted to take with, that you owned. Not that you want to take with, but you own. Single space. Now, if you will look, you may see it right after the indented part, the second line. My mother loved flowers. She had 35 vases. My father had a list that she had 35 vases. He had a list how many pillows she had, how many pillowcases, how many chairs, how many whatever, how many knives, forks, etc. You had a list. And then you were taxed. There is 6 pages of this. And then you were taxed on all of that as well. They had a very, very systematic way of doing this. That was my father's right to work. This was the passport. As you can see, it was issued obviously by the Nazis. And there you'll see my mother's name, Dora Heilbronner, and right under the name Dora, the Nazis wrote Sarah. As I said, that was going to be her middle name, together that she was born Loeb. That was, which I said before. And then below it, und zwei Kinder, 2 children, which was my brother and I. And there's my brother and I, ready to go. And I always know exactly the date that we left, because stamped in that passport was the stamp of the Swiss government when we passed through the border to get into Switzerland. Now, the factory was continuing. However, in July of 1939, a few months after we left, a gentleman walked into the factory and said to my grandfather, "Hi, my name is so-and-so. I am now the owner of your factory." That's how it worked. "And I want you to write a letter to your clients introducing me to them." So my father wrote a letter to the clients introducing this gentleman, Mr. Walter Liebfritz. And it was signed Hochanwald, which is very truly yours, Gebrüder Brothers Loeb. On the other side of that document, he wrote, introducing himself. And like every good German who supported the Nazi system and who was in government, they didn't sign the letter, "Very truly yours." They signed it, "Heil Hitler." And there you see it, Heil Hitler and his name. And so there went the factory. Thank God for the RAF. The RAF, of course, the Royal Air Force, was paying Germany back for the blitzkrieg that was upon them by the Nazis in London in the 40s, in 40. As you probably have read, there was bombing in London day after night after night after night. Well, by 1945, things turned, and the British bombers did their job. That was the factory. The only thing that you could recognize from it was the chimney. That didn't come down, but the rest was gone. So that was basically the end of this part of our life. We came to the United States. We first traveled to Switzerland. My father had an aunt who lived there. In 1938, my father, fearing what was happening, used to visit her and hide some of my mother's jewelry in the hubcaps of the car so that if we ever got out, we would have some money, because all the Nazis would let us take over was $500. Well, it was equal to $500 for my mother and $500 for my father, which was not a lot of money. So we had the jewelries to sell. Then we went to Paris, where my father's younger brother was, to say goodbye, because he did not know whether he would ever see him again. And then on to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where we boarded our ship to come to this country. And we left there on March 8th. Let me get it correct. Yes, March 8th, 1939, and we arrived in New York Harbor on March 26th, which happened to be a Sunday. You had to be told in by a pilot boat. I don't know whether they still do that in the Hudson or not, but in those days, a pilot boat had to tug you in. So we were sitting outside where the Veriano Bridge is now. The captain of the tug came aboard, and he thought he was going to do us a great favor, my brother and I. He brought us the comics from the New York News, Dick Tracy. Of course, we couldn't understand a word that was going on because we couldn't speak English. We didn't speak English. My parents spoke English, but we didn't speak a word of English. But finally, came Monday morning at 6 o'clock. The ship started to move, and my father made sure that both my brother and I were awake at that time. So as the ship sailed past the Statue of Liberty, we could see it. And so we landed on March 27, 1939, in this country. And so we moved eventually to Perry, New York. But the problem was that to them in Perry, New York, first of all, Perry, about 1/3 of the population, 1/4 to a third, is of Polish descent. And we arrived in Perry on September 1, 1939, the day the Germans invaded Poland. My father had been there before to start working, so they knew we were German. There was no welcome wagon for us. In fact, we were their enemy. As you may have seen in that television, like at the border, southern border, in the 1930s, they didn't want us. Why? They didn't want us because we were going to take their jobs. Don't let them in. They're going to take our jobs. Isn't that what we heard here on the southern border all the time? Don't let these Mexicans in. They're going to take our jobs. Why are we having unemployment in this country? And the other thing they were saying, they're nothing but murderers and rapists. We were spies. We were considered spies. When my father got a letter, I don't have, I have it in my little packet. Every letter that my father got or my mother got from anybody in Germany during that time was opened by the U.S. government and read to make sure that it wasn't any instructions by the Nazis for us to form a front here in this country. They didn't recognize that we were the enemies of the Nazis as well. They came into our house and disabled shortwave, because that was the only way that you used to be able to get news from Europe. That's how any of you or your parents or grandparents got news about the London Blitz from Edward R. Murrow, who used to report daily from London, was through shortwave. They disbanded that on all of our radios because they didn't want us to get any information, any orders from the Nazis in this country. When there was an air raid, they were made, and there were sample air raids. Our house was the first house that they went to make sure that all the blinds were down, that there was no light seeping through any of the shades to give any airplanes, if there were any airplanes coming over, that they could see the houses. There was a mutual friends club in Perry for ladies, and my mother wanted to join. A doctor and his wife, a Jewish doctor, had come to Perry. That's where we went, to Perry, New York, about 6 months earlier, actually 9 months earlier, and she had become a member of the club. And when my mother made the application, she was very nicely told, we only take one Jew. Right after the war started in 1941, a delegation came to the factory where my father was working, and he went to the president of the company and said to the president, you know, you've got a German working for you. You need to get rid of him. Thank goodness, as far as the president was concerned. And I only learned about this a few years ago when I was on a television program, local access, with the son of the president who told that. Because my father never told me anything about this. He said, my father said to the gentleman, over there is a door, goodbye. And kept my father, of course. But that was, and what for my brother and I'm sure that most of you in growing up had very close friends, some that you knew when you were 3 years, 4 years old, and you would get invited to parties, etc. We moved to the Perry when I was almost 7 years old. From that time until I graduated from high school, I never was invited to a birthday party. But that was life. That's what it was like. But, you know, I survived. I'm here, and I say, I'm telling my story because I think it's important for you to see that things that are happening today are echoing some of the problems that we have, where in Germany, government just broke down, one party took over and just annihilated everything. What scares the dickens out of me was on January 6, 1922, 140 members of the Republican House of Representatives, representing over 50% of them, voted against seating a duly elected President of the United States, going against their oath to uphold the United States Constitution and seeking to destroy the democracy that we're living under. If that doesn't scare you, it scares me. And I always finish my talk with another quote, which I find so important these days. It says, the weapons of mass destruction are not the atomic weapons. They are hate, intolerance, and bigotry. And as long as we have that in this country, unfortunately, we will be in trouble. And we see too often so much of that hate, whether it's shooting up 11 innocent worshipers in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, or shooting up innocent people in the synagogue in California or in Texas, or shooting people of color in their churches in South Carolina. Aren't houses of worship supposed to be places of sanctuary? And in schools, aren't we sending our children or grandchildren into schools because this is a safe harbor where they are there to learn? And every day, mothers and fathers, grandparents wonder, is their child coming home? My friends, I'm not going to be here much longer, but it's you who are going to have to speak up and change this and make this the country that it used to be again. Not make America great, as was advertised, because right now it's not great, but make it the way it should be. So that's my talk, and as was indicated, I'm more than happy to take whatever questions you may have. I'll try to answer them. As one of my professors in law school used to say, there are no dumb questions, only dumb answers. So,
actually, we've run over the time. I know a lot of people have 2 o'clock classes, including myself. So feel free to linger if you want to talk to Mr. Heilbronner. But in the meantime, I thank him again very much for sharing his experience in raising Holocaust awareness. And thank you very much for everyone coming to commemorate this very worthy occasion. Thank you.
Oh, now I can see.